Okay, class. So for today, we begin the section of the class on existentialism. So I'll begin by talking about what that term means, what this movement of existentialism means. Then I'll give you some background in terms of Soren Kierkegaard, his life. I'll give you the love story, which I worked into those test cases on Condon Mill. And then we'll jump into the first parts of the present age. So to begin with, existentialism as a movement in philosophy was only called that in the 20th century, and especially among French intellectuals around World War II. But those people were looking back to earlier thinkers who weren't part of a movement, who were just individual thinkers doing their own thing. And primarily Soren Kierkegaard is one of them, and the other one is Friedrich Nietzsche. Existentialism is part of Romanticism, that movement that we talked about in relation to John Stuart Mill, in which people were reacting against the overemphasis on reason in the Enlightenment, and instead emphasizing the importance of passion and the passions, and in particular the importance of passions for a meaningful life. One of the things that the existentialists really want to address is the fact that oftentimes life is not rational. There's a lot of things that we address in life that don't make sense, and how to have a philosophy that, instead of ignoring those irrational parts of life, a philosophy that addresses them. This is one of the things that existentialists want. But another major part of existentialism is addressing what you might call the problem of meaning. Around the late 19th centuries, thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard are looking around and they're saying, look, we've made these great advances in politics. Now almost everybody is free. We've made these great advances in science. We can do amazing things we haven't done before, including great advances in medicine, saving lives that would have otherwise been lost. We have these enormous advances in knowledge, right? We have enormous advances economically in terms of bringing people's level of economic well-being up, and understanding economics well enough to have better run economies. And yet, people like Soren Kierkegaard are saying, you would think, given all of that, that we'd all be happy. But instead, it seems like the real dilemma for the modern age is not one of making people more free or more prosperous, but rather finding a meaning to life. And Soren Kierkegaard, this is something he himself lived through, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, but it's something that, looking around, he thought, there are so many people who are prosperous and politically free, and yet they don't seem to have a meaningful life. And one of the things that existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard wanted to do is address that problem of meaning. How can we point people back to a meaningful life? And then another aspect of existentialism, which is very much influenced by Kant and the ideas of autonomy, is a strong emphasis on individual responsibility. The idea that each person is always put in a position where they need to make individual choices for themselves and carve out a meaningful life for themselves. So you have a very strong, you might even call it kind of radical individualism, where not only do we have the autonomy to set our own laws, and yet there'll be universal laws, the way it was for Kant, say, but now there's a sense of each one of us needs to carve out a meaningful existence for ourselves. But how to do that? So these are some of the questions or problems that existentialism as an overall movement addresses. Now I'll say a few things about one of the founders of existentialism, maybe the earliest founder, Soren Kierkegaard. You can see by his funny name, the O with the line through it, the double A, he's Danish. And in fact, Kierkegaard is the common Danish word for graveyard. His family, going back many generations, had taken care of the churchyard or graveyard in their parish church, and so that's where he got his last name. Kind of like with John Stuart Mill, in order to understand Kierkegaard, it helps to understand a bit about his father. His father came from the part of Denmark called Jutland, which is kind of the boonies. It's kind of the less fashionable place to come from. It's mostly a kind of vast, uninhabitable land where nothing can really grow. He was a poor shepherd boy there, and then an uncle came from Copenhagen and brought him back to be an assistant in his shop. And Kierkegaard's father did so well at this that he eventually ran the shop, then opened another shop, then opened a series of shops, eventually petitioned the government to allow him to expand what he was able to sell, and made an enormous amount of money and retired early. He was kind of, we think of this as a typical American story, but this is a rags to riches story where his father became a millionaire and then retired early and decided to devote his life to his cultural and religious and intellectual pursuits. And so he had this household in which he would bring the most famous theologians and intellectuals and artists and musicians into his house, and they would have these long discussions. And as a young boy, Soren Kierkegaard was exposed to all of this. And he loved to discuss ideas, and he loved to listen to great music and look at great art, and to be filled with the kind of inspiration of those things. His father was also a very strictly religious man. And it's the same religious, or really kind of subdivision of religion that Kant was. He was a pietist Lutheran. So he lived a very austere life, very wary of any sort of self-interest, and very much devoted to living this very kind of stark life of absolute, kind of self-control and self-denial. As often happens in households like this, Soren Kierkegaard, as a young man, went the other way and rebelled entirely. He was the youngest son, and he, instead of living this very strict life of self-denial, he went the other way, and he roared through an enormous amount of his father's money when he was a teenager and in his early 20s. He would go to the finest cafes, he would smoke the best cigars, he would drink the best coffee, he would have champagne lunches every day at the most expensive restaurants and hotels. He also became kind of the original slacker student. He went to the University of Copenhagen ostensibly to get a degree in theology, and he just stayed there. And he basically just, spent all his time in cafes and living it up and never studied for his exams. And he became quite well known around town as this brilliant young man who you would want at your cocktail parties because he was always incredibly witty. And it seemed like he was just this kind of witty, cynical guy who didn't care about anything. He didn't need to care about anything because his father's money. But the people of Copenhagen thought, yeah, this guy's witty to be around. He's fun to be around, but he's never going to make anything of himself. Right? His father's money has ruined him because he doesn't need to get a job and need to do anything. He's lost. And to some extent, Soren Kierkegaard found that out for himself. He writes in his journal entries about going to this party among some of the leading intellectuals of Copenhagen, and he was just the toast of the party. He was on his best game, cracking witty jokes, entertaining people. Everybody loved him. And he talked about how he was walking home after this, and he paused underneath a lamppost, and he just thought, what's the meaning behind that? Right? How is this valuable at all? Yeah, I'm this witty guy, but where's the meaning to my life? And he had a very hard time working out that question on his own. And he never knew, in part, what he wanted to do with his life. Yes, he was training to be a priest, and yet he had trouble joining the priesthood, in part because at the time, and even to this day, the Danish church is an official religion of the Danish federal government. And the Danish people pay a tax, and they have essentially a kind of federally run church into which everybody is automatically a member. Even to this day, you have to sign a bunch of paperwork and somehow prove that you're not a member of the Danish Reformed Lutheran Church in order to get out of it. And Kierkegaard thought, there's something odd about that. This seems very different from what Jesus was trying to set forward. And so he was always hesitant about whether he really wanted to go into the priesthood and to be a government functionary of religion. He thought that was contrary to the religion he was supposed to be presenting. But moreover, he didn't know what else he might want to do. Eventually, he found his calling as a writer. And he started writing books. And because he had this reputation as somebody who would never do anything worthwhile, he had the sense of keeping that a secret, the fact that he was a writer. And one of the things that Kierkegaard did as a philosopher, as a philosophical writer, was he wanted to take philosophy back to Socrates. He thought that Socrates had the real idea about what philosophy is as a discipline that gets people to think for themselves about what is good and virtuous and what makes life meaningful. Right? The idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that it's possible to have a life worth living. Kierkegaard thought, like Socrates, that's not something you can teach somebody directly. Here's how to go live a meaningful life. He thought, like Socrates, the job of the philosopher is to get people to think for themselves. And so one of the things that he did in response to that was he tended to write his books under a pseudonym. A pseudonym means a fake name. And so even today, there's oftentimes authors who will write under a fake name. And usually they do that either because they want to protect their identity or because they don't want people to know who the real author is. Kierkegaard developed this idea of pseudonyms in which he would write about life from different perspectives, different people living different ways of life. And he would write each one of these books from the first person perspective of the person living that way. But then instead of appearing in his own name to say which way of life was best, he insisted that that's simply up to each person to decide. And so next time we'll be reading excerpts from his book, Either Or. And Either Or compares the life of pleasure, the life of enjoyment, and the life of ethical responsibility. But instead of appearing in his own name to say, look, you got to live a life of ethical responsibility, or you really ought to live a life of pleasure, Kierkegaard thought his task was just to present each one of these as best he could from the first person perspective under a different pseudonym, right? And then force people to choose for themselves, hence the title Either Or. As I said, Kierkegaard thought of this as the way that Socrates did philosophy. And when Kierkegaard describes the term for the kind of philosophy he thought he ought to be done, he says this is existential philosophy. Now, these days, we think of existentialism as a very modern movement beginning in the late 19th century. But in fact, according to Soren Kierkegaard, this is philosophy itself. Socrates was an existentialist. By demanding that each one of us think for ourselves about what makes for a good and meaningful life, he thought, yeah, that's Socratic philosophy or existential philosophy, one and the same thing. In the book that we're reading, The Present Age, Kierkegaard is not using a pseudonym. He's writing this in his own name. And what he's doing is he's giving a social critique. He's critiquing his society and, by extension, modern society as a whole. And he talks about this great divide between what he considers the current age of reflection and an earlier age of passion. And that's one of the main things that we'll talk about today is that great distinction. But one nice way of getting into that distinction is to talk about how this plagued Kierkegaard himself, right? And this criticism that he makes of the age, that it's overly reflective, is very much one that he gets from his own experiences as an overly reflective person. And I'll tell you the love story behind his life, which I think illustrates this problem of reflection and passion. And this is what I made reference to in those Kant and Mill worksheet, where Soren is in love with Regina and is not sure whether to marry him. So this comes about in the period of his life where he's just starting to work out his role as a writer. And he feels like maybe he's finally found some source of meaning there. And then he meets and falls in love with this very beautiful, very brilliant young woman named Regina Olsen. She came from a very well-known and respected family. She was as well-educated as a woman could be in those times. And she was absolutely in love with Soren. So they're in love with each other. They're exchanging ideas. Eventually, they get engaged to be married. And everybody around town is so happy. Everybody's talking about this engagement. And they're quite the couple around town. And then suddenly, Soren Kierkegaard breaks off the engagement. And he sends back the ring, and he says, I can't marry you. Nobody really knows why. One excuse he gave, and this is what I worked into that worksheet, is he said, look, I want to be a writer, but if I get married, I'm going to have to live a life of responsibility and get a real job, and I don't think I can handle that. This is a little bit bogus because as his father's money would have kept him and the whole family just fine. He would not have needed to get a real job. Other times he said, no, I have this kind of religious calling. I can't get married because I need to devote my life to my religious calling and to God. The problem here is, as a Protestant and as somebody looking to be a member of the Protestant clergy, there's really no problem with Protestant clergy being married. So this is also kind of bogus. I suspect he just got cold feet, right? But to give you a sense of the way that he treated this relationship, he breaks off the engagement with Regina, and about a few days later, he gets on a boat, he goes to Berlin in Germany, And he writes an enormous book called Either Or. That's what we'll read excerpts from later. And Either Or looks at the life of the young man who never wants to get married, who's living this life of enjoyment. And then that's the first part of the book. And the second part of the book is about an older man who gets married and devotes himself to the life of the committed marriage. And Kierkegaard looks at this, exactly the dilemma in his own life, and he uses that to try to bring out philosophical reflections on these two different ways of life. He then goes back to Copenhagen with this book in his suitcase. He gets it published. And part of what he used in describing the life of enjoyment is he used his own journal entries from the time that he was dating and engaged to Regina. And he implies there in his book that he had seduced her for the sake of pleasure and basically tricked her into having sex with him, even though he never intended to marry. This is actually completely bogus. The truth is there was an incident in which when they were together, Regina was somehow a little bit too forward with Soren, and he ran home and then sent her a copy of the New Testament as a rebuke because she was kind of too forward with him. But he wanted to cultivate this sense that he broke off the engagement because he was some kind of scoundrel. And he wanted to kind of deflect all the shame of the broken engagement onto him and off of Regina. Right? And so, in part, this was one of the things he was trying to do with the book Either Or. But of course, everybody instead is reading the book and they're just turning to the passages. They're looking for the sex scene, right? And they're looking for what seems to be his actual journal entries while he's dating Regina. And of course, this only has the result of bringing all the shame down on Regina once more. So instead of the public simply knowing that she was the girl who was dumped by Soren Kierkegaard, now everybody's reading these kind of intimate details of her life. Despite this, after a while, Soren starts thinking, I broke it off with this girl, we were in love, maybe we can get back together again, right? And he has this idea, maybe we can get back together again. And he takes his daily walks around Copenhagen, she takes her daily walks around Copenhagen, and they meet almost every day. And she simply nods at him and he nods at her, but they never speak. Right? And then one day in church, it's Easter Sunday, they're in church, she's sitting several pews ahead of him, and she turns around to Soren, and she gives him a nod. And he's like, what? And then she gives him another nod and a smile. And then he thinks, oh yeah, it's back on. I got her back, right? I gave her up, right? But now I'm getting her back. Now, you would think a normal person would maybe try to talk to her, maybe say he was sorry for breaking it off with her and then publishing a book about it. But instead, this is Soren Kierkegaard. What does he do? He gets back on a boat. He goes back to Berlin. He checks into the same hotel he lived in before, and he writes another book about this experience of giving something up and regaining again. That's the book Fear and Trembling, where he looks at the story of Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac and yet regaining Isaac back again. He also writes a second book called Repetition, and it's about a guy who keeps coming back to the same hotel in Berlin and writing books. Then he goes back to Copenhagen with these books in his suitcase. He's all excited. He thinks that Regina is going to be waiting for him, and he's going to get married, and it's going to be awesome. And he gets back there, and he's preparing to publish these books, and then he hears from a friend. Regina's actually marrying somebody else. And the nod in church, that was the nod of like, it's okay now, even though you've been a horrible guy, because I'm marrying this other guy. So they never got married. She married this other guy. And yet, they would still take these walks, and they would still see each other every day for the rest of their lives, but they would never speak again. They would simply give each other this kind of nod. So if you see that, you can understand that when Kierkegaard talks about people being overly reflective and in this age of over-reflection, this is not just him kind of snidely criticizing his neighbors. This is very much a matter of self-criticism. So now let's look at some of the things he says about this in the text, The Present Age. So the very first line says, our age is essentially one of understanding and reflection, without passion, momentarily bursting into enthusiasm, and shrewdly relapsing into repose. Right? So he says, we have understanding and reflection, but we don't have passion. We have momentary bursts of enthusiasm, and then we kind of relapse into a shrewd repose. And then if you look at what he says on page 6, he says, he contrasts the age of reflection with an age of passion. And he associates passion with the age of revolution. Right? And most likely he's thinking here of things like the French Revolution, right, which he considers this kind of passionate endeavor where people were trying to make their lives better. They're risking their own lives to try to overthrow an old regime and set up a new, better way of life. And he says, we don't have that kind of passion anymore. Now we kind of talk about things and we reflect on things, right? And we have a lot of publicity and advertisement, but we don't really have these great movements, these great changes anymore. So he says on page 6, a revolutionary age is an age of action. Ours is the age of advertisement and publicity. Nothing ever happens, but there's immediate publicity everywhere. Right? So let's talk about this contrast between reflection and passion. By reflection, what he means is not thinking per se, but this kind of mode of life in which everything's a matter of abstraction. Everything's a matter of kind of cleverness, where people talk about ideas, they can easily exchange ideas, but nobody really has that sort of drive, that sort of passion that makes them go out and do something and accomplish something. Right? He says, instead of real accomplishments, instead of real greatness, what we have is endless publicity and hype and advertisement. He says that's the situation in the modern age. Right? There's always hype, but what that's really masking is the fact that there's not true passion. Right? And what goes along with passion for him is action. Right? If I'm passionate about something, if I'm devoted to it, I'm going to act. Right? And for him, passion is necessary for commitment. Right? Consider the difference between somebody who's kind of momentarily interested in, say, playing soccer and somebody who's passionate about soccer. Right? Somebody who's momentarily excited about soccer, right? Yeah, they might go play for a while until it gets boring, and then they find something else to do. Right? In contrast, somebody who has the passion for soccer is the kind of person who's going to be out there practicing, even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, even when they're losing. Right? They're committed to being a better soccer player. Right? And so he says, we live in a world where we tend to have an age where it's dominated by reflection, and it tends to be missing passion. But all of that is lost on us because we have this endless publicity and hype, which seems to be the same thing. Right? The fact that people are momentarily enthusiastic about one thing and then something else and then something else covers over the fact that nobody has a deep, long-standing commitment to anything. Let's talk about a couple of examples where he sees this. One of which that you read about, he talks about scholarship itself. And you might think, okay, well, scholars, that's all a matter of reflection, not passion. But Kierkegaard thinks, not so. Right? Think about somebody like Isaac Newton. Right? Sure, when we study Newtonian laws, it seems like these are abstractions. But think about Newton himself. Right? This is somebody who is deeply passionate about science, deeply passionate about mathematics. It bothered him that he hadn't yet figured out the laws of physics. Right? This is something he was deeply committed to working out over many years. Right? And then publishing it and then arguing for it. Right? That is a matter of passion leading to action and commitment, even in the realm of scholarship. Right? But he says, among the young men of today, a profound and prodigious learning is almost unthinkable. They would find it ridiculous. Right? So he says, yeah, among people today, people think, look, let's just learn a little bit about a bunch of different subjects. Right? But the idea of becoming an expert, the idea of devoting your life to some sort of field of study, he thinks, yeah, that's not in vogue anymore. Right? That seems almost ridiculous. Right? I'm devoting my whole life to learning about physics. Right? Why not learn about physics and a whole bunch of other things, just a little bit of each of those subjects? Right? So this is one of his examples of how an earlier age of passion produced a certain kind of greatness, say, of science, right, or any other field of scholarship. And in contrast, he says, now we have a whole population that's well educated and knows a little bit about a whole range of things, but they're not they're not passionate about any of those things, right? And there's no real commitment behind any of that. Right? Let's talk about why passion and commitment are so important, right? One of the main reasons has to go back, deals with that issue of meaning that we talked about before. Kierkegaard thinks that if you have an age where everything's a matter of publicity and hype and mere abstractions, right, that is not going to give your life meaning, right? So let's suppose I'm excited about playing soccer for a few hours, and then I'm excited about playing Monopoly, and then I'm excited about maybe cooking for a few hours, right? And then I find that boring and I move on to something else I'm excited about. That is not going to ground my life in meaning. Right? In fact, Kierkegaard would say that is a recipe for a meaningless life. And so in part, when he looks at this problem of meaning that he thinks plagues the modern world, He thinks it has a lot to do with our whole approach. And the fact that we live these lives of reflection, publicity, hype, temporary enthusiasm is precisely what drains our life of real commitment and real meaning. He thinks instead, though, if you have a passionate life that leads you to act decisively and be committed to things, within that commitment, within that thing that you're committed to, you can find meaning. So think about, say, the soccer player we talked about before. The passionate soccer player who devotes themselves to it, they can find meaning in that struggle to be a better soccer player, right? Even when they lose, right? There's still that sense that they lost in the context of a passionate commitment that's giving their life meaning, right? In contrast, the person who's merely excited momentarily about soccer, even if they win, right? That's not going to be a meaningful accomplishment for them. Okay? So that's one example. Now let's look at another thing that he says about acting on principle. This is one of the targets that he comes back to again and again in the present age. We just found him here in the first few pages mentioning it once. This is on page 5. He says, during the Revolution, arms were distributed freely, just as during the Crusades, the insignia of the exploit were bestowed upon men. But nowadays, people are supplied with rules of careful conduct and ready reckoners to facilitate judgment. Right, let's talk about what this contrast is. He's saying, look, in earlier times, if you were passionate about overthrowing the government and setting up a better world, a better government for people, people distributed arms, right? They distributed weapons, right? And then we would go out and we would kind of, as a group, we would change the world. But he says, instead, today, what are we given, right? What is it that our intellectuals of today are providing us with? What he calls rules of careful conduct and ready reckoners to facilitate judgment. Ready reckoner, a better translation might be something like easy calculator to facilitate judgment. Right? He's saying, today our intellectuals give us these kind of an easy to use calculus to facilitate our judgment. What kinds of things are we thinking about? We've seen these things for ourselves. When we talked about things like Kant's categorical imperative or Mill's utility principle, think about what those things were supposed to be. They were supposed to be a kind of calculus that, given any action, you simply put it through their little test, and then the outcome would be what you ought to do. Right? And if you remember, this was kind of the great dream of Enlightenment era ethics, is to provide the people with this sort of simple principle they can always use, and thereby always make the right decision on whatever action they're thinking about. What's Kierkegaard's problem with this? What's his critique? He's saying this is a matter of reflection, but not passion, and yet he doesn't fully clarify what's the problem here. Right? But to help you think of that, let's begin with what the modern version of this might be. Imagine you have an app for your iPhone, right? A Kantian categorical imperative app, say, or utility principle app. And given any action, you simply need to input what that action is, right? Maybe it's voice activated. You say, I'm here in 7-Eleven, I'm thinking about stealing these chips, is that okay? And then your phone runs it through the utility principle or the categorical imperative test and says, no, that action would be immoral. And so then I say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And imagine if I'm not following this app on my phone blindly, right? Maybe I took this class or similar class in ethics, and I know the background. I know why categorical imperative is supposed to work, right? Or I know why the utility principle is supposed to work, right? So it's not that I'm following this heteronomously, right? I am choosing. I'm saying I believe in the Kantian categorical imperative, right? But what if I live my life where before any action, I simply input it into my phone and I do what my phone, the output is, right? Is that a great life? Is this the moral life that Socrates wanted, right? Kierkegaard implies no. But for your first reflection question, I want to ask you, is somebody who always does what their phone tells them to do, is that person a moral hero for you? Would you admire that person? Would you think that this is a worthy and noble and meaningful life? Or is there something missing there, right? Because it seems like this person, let's assume, as Kierkegaard does, that these principles are correct in pointing out what is moral or immoral, right? But his point is more, somebody who always follows such a principle, there's something missing there. This doesn't seem to be a meaningful life. So your first reflection I want to ask you to ask yourselves, is Kierkegaard right here that something would be wrong with a person who simply abides by those ready reckoners, these principles like the categorical imperative and the utility principle? Right? Is there something missing from that life, or is that sufficient? Would somebody who always follows the output that their phone suggests a moral hero for you, somebody you would admire, or not?